Hello, and welcome to Jenna and Jason's discussion of human information behavior as it pertains to an educational setting. When we speak about education, we are of course talking about learning. But before we get into exactly what that word entails, let's take a second to discuss information literacy. Information literacy, or one's proficiency at accessing, organizing, and assimilating information, is at the heart of what we call learning, and is a skill that is only gaining importance as information systems and access proliferate. So what do we mean exactly when we talk about learning? Learning is an active process of information assimilation. This can be in a classroom setting or enculturation. The important thing to recognize is that it is a dynamic interaction with information. This makes it fundamentally different from a data dump into a computer. The human brain interacts with and interprets the information. For much of Western history, the theory of education was a simple linear path. A student sits in front of a teacher, the teacher transfers information to the student assimilates that information and builds a knowledge base as more blocks of information are added. But new studies suggest this may not be the most efficient way to learn. Passivity does not encourage interaction with the information. For example, when children learn language through everyday interactions, the context is immediately apparent. They are able to interpret the subtleties and nuances of meaning through conversation and interaction with the language. But often, when vocabulary is taught out of dictionaries, mistakes in usage are more common, because the student has little context within which to situate the word. As Todd's example points out, abstract concepts without real-world context are much more difficult to interact with and thus assimilate into our knowledge base. These real-world activities are what he calls authentic action, and this concept is predicated on the idea that our interactions with information is indexical. We'll speak more on this a bit later. Factual knowledge and skills are always learned within the context of the culture in which we assimilate them. The closer this culture is to real-world application, the more useful we find this information, and the more likely we are to retain it. Thus, information that we find the most useful becomes more profoundly incorporated into our worldview. Much of our learning is to some extent subconscious, and this type of learning is often referred to as enculturation. But really, there is no difference in the mechanics of enculturation and what we might call book learning, except that enculturation affects us on a much more profound level. Things we learn through repeated exposure or in the setting of its own culture become much more deeply ingrained. If we are asked to assimilate abstract concepts without application, we find it much more difficult to situate this information correctly. As this slide shows, traditional schooling necessarily forces students to learn in a school culture that is not authentic to the information being taught. In such a setting, students often learn by rote memory, but do not incorporate this knowledge into their worldview because they have no genuine context or applicable experience to apply to the information. Such a model is often antithetical to practical learning and long-term retention of the information transferred. Skills and knowledge are best assimilated within the context of the culture of use. This learning by doing method encourages retention because the usefulness of the skills or knowledge is immediately apparent. By applying substance and meaning to the learning process, the student is encouraged to see purpose in the task at hand. In his paper, Todd uses the example of an apprentice tailor who begins with ironing. No, ironing is not the same as sewing, but a great deal of knowledge about cloth and clothing construction can be gained through a task that has purpose and is situated within the framework of sewing culture. Knowing that our relationship to information is indexical, it stands to reason that activities performed within the culture of the skill or subject being learned will have a more profound impact. This type of information should stand a better chance of being retained than rote memorization or ersatz repetition. School is very much its own culture, and thus concepts learned in school are often relegated as inauthentic or not applicable to real-world situations. Though subjects like math and reading comprehension have incredible real-world value, the culture within which they are learned devalues them for many students. Ross Todd conducted a study to examine how school students approach new topics of learning, and what their knowledge structure looked like at different phases of a research project. What he found was that all the students started with vague concepts and approached the research process through amassing a fact list. As more facts were introduced, the focus often became sharper. At this point, two distinct approaches became evident. Some students took an integrative approach and managed to synthesize these facts into coherent representations, abstract concepts, and come to positional or predictive conclusions. However, other students continued with an additive approach, where they continued to add more and more information to the project without any meaningful interpretation. In Augusto and Hugh Hassel's study, teens were interviewed outside of school about their information searches in real life. What was found is that the way teens seek out information in their day-to-day lives does not mirror that of the typical classroom. The respondents got their information from many sources as well as their own personal experiences. Exploration within the cultural context and authentic action led to self-discovery and empowerment. It is important, when addressing education, to consider what motivates children and teens to seek out information in the first place. What engages them? What encourages genuine curiosity and desire to learn? How can those motivations be used to encourage them in a wide range of subjects? Cognitive apprenticeship is a model that may help to alleviate some of this school culture bias. Far from simple artisan or tradesman apprenticeships of old, cognitive apprenticeship looks at all subjects as potentially teachable from within the authentic culture of use. Mathematics, for example, may be approached by looking at certain problems, deducing ways of finding the answer, and from there formulating or revealing rules and equations. This is the reverse of the way the subject is often taught, where students are given abstract formula, asked to plug in numerical values, and arrive at a correct answer through instruction rather than through construction. In such a system, what is the teacher's task? Well, clearly, having the knowledge base to help students tackle problems is essential. But in the cognitive apprenticeship model, teachers are coaches more so than instructors. The student is given authentic, meaningful, and real-life applicable tasks. The teacher becomes a resource on which the student can call, as opposed to an authority on which the student relies. A teacher may even lead by example by addressing the problem along with the student. As long as this is done not in a patronizing way, this experience can be quite empowering for the student and encourage long-term retention. Here are a few questions that may stimulate conversation as to what the best road to the future of education may be. There are myriad teaching models. Some may be suited to certain students better than others. Some may be more detrimental than beneficial. Look back on your primary and secondary education. What engaged you? What did not? Education is one of the most vital aspects of modern life. What can be done to encourage and empower students? Here is a list of references that you may find useful as you continue to research this topic. Thank you for listening, and I hope you found this presentation informative.